It is my pleasure to give the Zoom room floor over to you, Jane, and take it away.
Thank you very much. And apologies to any of you that came last time when I had computer problems and all sorts of issues. If you were, many apologies about that. So thank you very much for the invite. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just say a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of work and employment relations at the University of Leeds, and I mainly teach employment relations. But before I came into academia, I had lots of jobs. I worked in the print industry, in publishing, and I was a trade union rep, and I got bullied out of my job for my trade union activities. And while I was working, it was actually at a university, and while I was working there, I did an MA Masters in Labour and Trade Union Studies. And so when I got bullied out of my job, I went to do a PhD, which was funded by the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, to look at trade unions organising of migrant workers. And so I accidentally sort of just ended up in academia. It wasn't my intention to come into academia, but sometimes, you know, best laid plans and all that, you sort of, you know, just end up where you end up. So I spend my time now doing research into trade unions and to organising, particularly in relation to community organising as well, and the link between the two. So I'm going to talk to you about my book today, which I published last year, and I wrote down in the first period of lockdown. And I'll speak for about 30 minutes, if that's okay, and then we can just have a general discussion, if that works for everybody. So about the book then. The book starts with this quote, which is from Eric Hobsbawm. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with his work. And it was in a sort of influential and perhaps controversial article that he wrote in 1978 called The Forward March of Labour Halted. And you can see that the title ended with a question mark. And I think I would probably argue today that it's probably no longer needed. The forward march of Labour did halt, you know, quite considerably in the 70s, 80s, certainly in the UK, but across other parts of the world as well. So the paper was from a speech he gave where he discussed the changing structure of British capitalism in the post-Second World War period and the detrimental effect that it was having on workers. And so I use the quote. So I use the quote at the start of the book, and I've gone back to this article because I think it's an important forward-looking and reflection on something that's gone unheeded, particularly in terms of ideas and strategies to engage with and organise the working class as a class in itself. And my research, as I said, is mainly focused on trade unions and community organising. And I think you know, it's useful to look back at what happened in 78, what he was saying in 1978, because I think, you know, it tells us a lot. And I think it's useful in reflecting back why we haven't been as good as we might have been in terms of organising working class communities. And I think now there's even more urgency than there perhaps was in 1978, because particularly in the UK, so for example, you know, our Conservative government has really started to use narratives of division, pitting ethnic minorities and the white working class against each other in an attempt to capture what once were working class Labour voting constituencies. And we've actually seen that having some impact. So I think it's important that we think about the ideas of sort of class, identity and power. So the key message in the article, which he wrote, said, although there's still a working class, a class in itself, it's an atomised working class that doesn't identify as a working class, that sort of Marxist, you know, a class for itself. So Hobsbawm's analysis shows that the fracturing of the working class has weakened both objective class power and subjective class consciousness. And I think, you know, these words could have been written today, actually, except current labour movement analysis would perhaps more talk in terms of global capitalism, the widespread neoliberal, you know, hegemony, which has curtailed the power of the working class. But I'd argue that the similar words could have also been written in the late 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution transformed both the form and place of work, leaving craft workers facing unemployment. There was a time when the growth of the new manual working class was quite spectacular during this period. It concentrated workers into mills, factories, mines, so that by the early 1900s, for example, over 3/4 of the British labour market was comprised of industrial manual workers. And I think a consequence of that change in format and structure of employment was that it facilitated the organisation of these workers into combines or trade unions due to their concentration in larger workplaces in the industrial sector. But I think what happened as a consequence of that was it developed a sort of common understanding of shared interests. There was a strong internal cohesion, I think, to this new working class, which encompassed an understanding of common everyday experiences. People had shared geographical networks that could be drawn on to change their working lives for the better. And the majority of workers at that time had a common ideological ground, or a more common ideological ground than they perhaps do today. For example, they were manual workers with similar pay and conditions. They lived in the same communities alongside craft workers and agricultural labourers. They had strong regional similarities with regional accent. All of this, I argue in my book, reinforces this sense of a class identity, which I think has been quite fractured since. And importantly, there were the others, the bosses, the factory owners, the landed gentry, who had a completely different ideological perspective to how society run. So people were then, I think, more acutely aware of their class position than perhaps they are today. They also recognised the extent to which it mattered to their material conditions. And going back to Hobsbawm again, he said, a century ago, the working class was deeply stratified, although it didn't prevent it from seeing itself as a class. He said this common understanding of a proletarian life, where people were drawn together through a growing class consciousness, came through went alongside sort of political demands, economic demands and political demands, running side by side, demands for a greater share of the profits from capitalism. So, what I'm trying to say is that industrial structures at this time were such that workers probably better understood the nature of power and how they could, when they combined with their fellow workers in unions, rebalance to some extent the power in favour of their own class and their own material interests. And of course, that's why unions grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they were able to fight for, and importantly, win better paying conditions for workers. And again, this is an element that I touch on in the book because it starts with a sort of historical analysis of the power of trade unions, and it brings it up to the current day to look at what's changed over time. And one of the key disputes that demonstrated workers' power and gave massive rise to a growth in what was termed New Unionism was 100,000 dockers who went out on strike in 1889. That's 100,000. We can't even contemplate what that's like these days in terms of strikes. But 100,000 dockers went out on strike for an increase in pay, which they won. And even if people didn't expressly articulate an understanding of power analysis, they knew it was possible to effect change by acting in concert with, their fellow workers. So the advance of the working class, or in Eric Hobsbawm's phrase, the forward march of labour, it began to slow in the late, say, 1940s, early 50s. And that sense of us, as a sort of collective began to break down and dissipate for a wide range of reasons, both social, political and economic. And that sort of, the understanding that unionism was for all workers, whatever their background and history, as had been in the case in the 1880s, began to change in the post-war period as the focus on sectional interests became a much more dominant practice within unions. And I think that led to a stratification amongst workers between those who were earning a good industrial wage, sometimes termed the labour aristocracy, and those who had structural power as a result of their ability, to extract concessions from employers. It was then compared to those that had less power and less collective bargaining power. So we saw that stratification taking place. And of course, these power differentials between workers and employers have always existed due to the nature of, the work that's undertaken. But there was a widening gap in the post-war period between two sections of the labour force. And they started to be ideologically pitted against each other. And of course, that was at the expense of class solidarity. And of course, alongside that, we had the growth in the service sector, white-collar professional occupations, and the sense of who was included in or who belonged to the working class was also beginning to change as a result of this. Classic example is bank workers. At that time, the post-war period, it was a very middle-class profession, but today it's effectively just been proletarianised. And despite wage earning differentials between workers being much narrower in the post-war period than they are today, people began to feel differently about class identification. I think this feeling about where people are positioned, class-wise makes a difference to labour organising. Then, they were still, in Marxist terms, members of the proletariat. They owned little more than their ability to sell their labour, but increasingly it mattered that they didn't feel working class and they felt separate from the class. So just to sort of finish on this bit of Hobsbawm and sort of move on. The conclusion of Hobsbawm's analysis of the declining power of the union movement and the crisis that it created for workers was that despite the impact of the change in structure of employment being unfavourable to the ability of workers to extract benefits from their employers, the labour movement needed to look carefully at its own actions and the lack of forward-thinking strategy. And that's what I've tried to do in the book. So it begins by reviewing the approaches to organising and revitalisation in the UK union movement over the last 20 to 30 years, but through the lens of power. And it leaps back to this period of new unionism. At the time, it was the gig economy of its time. There was no labour protection, there was no labour law, there was no labour legislation, and work was, for most workers, extremely precarious. And then the book then looks at periods when union power was at its height. In the 70s, we can see workers here, this was from Ford's, how they mobilised and did extremely well, and then how this was lost. So it takes Hobsbawm's challenge to analyse the reasons, historical and otherwise, for the failures of the success of the labour movement in more recent times. Okay, so I argue that the union movement is still really struggling to adopt an adequate response to the decline in union membership and also power. And I think time is running out. In 2020, trade union membership was 6.3 million in the UK, 23% of all employees, and I know that's much higher than it is in the US. But collective bargaining, often we use that as a sort of proxy indicator for union power, is just 26% overall, yet only 15% in the private sector. But that's where 83% of workers are found. But with trade union density so low and bargaining so weak, unions are finding it increasingly difficult to achieve significant gains on behalf of workers. And in truth, much collective bargaining often takes place in name only. So I love this quote from Alan Flanders. He was an industrial relations academic, and he wrote an article on what unions are for. And he talks about the importance of power in unions, but also their social purpose. And I think maybe this is something that unions have lost over time, but perhaps is something that they need to regain if they become more relevant to, the majority of workers. So in the post-war period, up to 1979, workers, as I said, were, I think, much more acutely conscious of the power of unions. Trade union leaders were widely recognised figures who appeared regularly on daily news. They were often seen in meetings with government and ministers. And one of my colleagues has said, such were the numbers in the union movement come the 60s and 70s that not only were trade union general secretaries household names, but prime ministers, both Labour and Conservative, feared and respected them in equal measure. And I grew up in the period where trade unions were strong in the 60s and the 70s, And there were constantly high-profile disputes. You could not watch TV or read a newspaper without, being aware of trade unions and what trade unions were doing. So high-profile disputes were much more common in this period, but today they're much more symbolic disputes rather than effective. So then, in the 60s and 70s, they were highly visible and very effective at effecting change. So just to put this into context, just briefly, the highest annual total for working days lost to strike was 162 million, but that was in 1926, almost 100 years ago. And of course, that was exceptional. It was the year of the general strike. But since then, there's only been 3 years when the annual total of working days lost has exceeded 20 million. The figures are on the screen. I'm not going to go through them. But since 2000, the highest annual total of working days lost was 1.4 million in 2011. And the more recent figures are from 2018. We've not really got much higher figures at the moment. Or more recent figures. The figures from 2018 are 273,000, involving 39,000 workers. So we're talking, really, really significant differences today. And in terms of the more recent disputes, they're mainly to do with my union, which is the University and Colleges Union, because we've had a whole series of disputes over the last couple of years over pensions and precarious working. So I'm just trying to highlight the difference in terms of, where we were and where we are in terms of strike days. So clearly, we can see that the industrial power of unions has been decimated over the last 40 years. And part of the answer to that is that unions haven't adapted to the adverse changing economic and political climate. And that's not to downplay, of course, the significance of neoliberalism and the challenges that raises. And also financialisation and restrictive labour laws, all those things. But unions do have agency. And my feeling is that a greater focus on understanding power would have helped unions to some extent be a bit more strategic in terms of building capacity. So I just want to run through quickly just some different forms of power at the disposal for workers, and then we can have some discussion. So the ending of Hobsbawm's article says that we need to analyse the reasons, historical and otherwise, for the failures as well as the successes of the labour movement and formulate not only what we want to do, but what can be done. And so I think this is where an understanding of power and strategic capacity comes in, because the employment relationship, of course, as we know, is one of an imbalance of power. So that's where I think the focus really needs to be. But all the education and training within trade unions, and I don't know whether this is the case in the US or not, but the education and training that unions do is very much focused on skills-based. It's about how to be a good union rep, how to negotiate, but actually without little understanding of power at its base. And I really like this quote that I've put on the screen. The workers' strategies constructed in the industrial age have been undermined, not because globalisation has eviscerated labour power, because it weakened all labour strategies and spurred aggressive new elite strategies with which labour has yet to cope. Okay, so let me just run through quickly then. Power. We can perhaps divide power into soft power and hard power. And in terms of hard power, we can obviously think about associational power. This is where workers, increase their power by combining with their work colleagues to take action to challenge the exploitation they face. And it's at the heart of what trade unions are really about. It's the capacity of union members to act collectively. Structural power or industrial power comes from the workers' position in the labour market and the economic system. And in a sense, it frames their potential ability to bargain in the workplace. So structural power can arise and come about as a result of a particular body of knowledge, for example, a skill or an understanding being scarce, skills being scarce. And when this is the case, workers, of course, and their unions have greater leverage to, effect whatever change that they're looking for, higher wages or whatever. Or it could be that certain types of work are grounded or fixed in place and can't easily be offshored, for example. But essentially, it's the ability to withdraw labour and have a considerable impact. And in the UK, the rail unions, particularly the ones that operate on the London Underground, for example, have massive leverage when it comes to taking industrial and structural power. They can bring London to standstill within a matter of 24 hours. So the rail unions often demonstrate that type of power really well. Okay, quickly moving on. Institutional power, the capacity to hold employers to account through laws and regulation at transnational level, at national level, at local levels. So thinking things like the national minimum wage, working time directives, all the sort of rules and regulations that give unions potential power. And of course, there's political power as well. Trade unions established the Labour Party here in the UK to create a voice for workers in Parliament, and traditionally political power has been expressed through the Labour Party, although that relationship has changed really significantly since the Labour Party was established in 1906. Okay, just a couple of points on soft power. There's a number of moral frames that trade unions have often used over the years, such as the right to work, health and safety, living wage, safer workplaces, all those things. And sometimes these moral frames have played a real strong role in gaining support from trade unions, both within their membership, but also from external players. And the living wage is one that's been particularly the case here in the UK. Okay, so my final comment on power then. The way we think about and talk about a subject has an influence on and reflects the ways we act in relation to that subject. So unions need to be able to act to take control of a narrative that frames their their social justice claims in a way that resonates with wider circle of people if they're to be effective. So we can think about that in terms of discursive power. So why then is this important for union organising today? I'd say that it's important to think strategically about power, and I don't think the turn to organising over the last 20, 30 years hasn't really given enough thought to the strategic use of power at our disposal. So there's very seldom, strategic, detailed power mapping that takes place in unions. And the main lever of structural power is through the use of threats or actual industrial action, and predominantly through strike action. But as I've showed you in those slides earlier, that's actually few and far between these days. There are not that many strikes taking place. And one of the key areas of discussion about trade union decline from the 1980s onwards is the anti-trade union legislation. We have very strong anti-trade union legislation here in the UK. And it was put into place from 1979 onwards through the Thatcher governments, through the Conservative governments from 1979 to 1997. And the laws were designed to restrict the power of trade unions, of course, outlawing things like secondary picketing, flying pickets, not being able to, transfer, workers not being able to secondary picket in other workplaces to try and, force employers to back down. And workers taking industrial action in support of other workers has often been a key strength of trade unions and their structural power. And when that was taken away, it had a serious impact. Nevertheless, I would argue, and I do argue this in the book, that it's important to remember that despite such restrictions in the past, legislation doesn't necessarily prevent industrial action. So we can take, for example, I know this is historical, but going back to the Munitions Act in 1915, the purpose of the legislation at this time was to ensure that war production was not disrupted by workers. Strikes in war industries were made illegal, and labour disputes were meant to be referred to compulsory tribunals. Yet from the time the Act was introduced to its repeal, just 4 years later, there were 1,274 industrial disputes, resulting in over 18 million days lost throughout strike action. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if the union movement is strong and workers have got confidence, then it doesn't matter what rules or regulations are in place. the institutional power that, that's used by state mechanisms such as legislation is never really a match for organised workers' power if there are sufficient numbers. And I think, in the past, workers have been very adept at understanding where the balance of power in the employment relationship lies. And they've also been very good at identifying strategies and tactics, that are needed to harness power for their own benefit. But I think that's much less the case it is today. So my question then is for us to think about is, what do we need to do to address, what are the reasons why trade unions lost so much power, say, between 1979 and today? And of course, one of the answers is that, well, it's just the anti-trade union laws and the changing structure of the labour market. But it doesn't necessarily explain why Thatcher and successive governments and the attacks on trade unions were as successful as they were. It's nearly 40 years since the UK union movement really acknowledged that it really needed to figure out a way to regain its power if it was to effect change. Yet despite new unionism, the turn to organising, less than a quarter of all workers, as I said, are in trade unions, and only 26 covered by collective bargaining. What are the reasons why the actions so far, because we've put, in the same as the US, we've put loads of money into organising, why have the actions so far not resulted in a revitalisation of the labour movement? Why has it proved so difficult to increase union organising membership and density? And I think it's not the only answer, but one answer is in part, I think, the actions of the unions themselves. So I just want to talk briefly about this before we have a discussion. So two of my colleagues, Lisa Lott, sorry, just moving this slide on. Lisa Lott, Lottie Hansen and Sue Ledworth wrote a book on gendering and diversifying trade union leadership. And they wrote about how the lack of diversity in leadership positions within unions works against transformational change because it limits the capacity for strategic thinking. So the power relations in unions, we've talked about power relations outside of unions, but the power relations within unions, are also problematic. They're not only gendered, they're also racialised as well. And I think that feeds in to particular social processes and cultural practices that influence who's encouraged or elected into leadership positions. And I think one of the problems is without the ability to draw upon the lived experiences of a much more diverse group of leaders, there's a tendency for committees and leaders to adopt familiar repertoires of action, even when these are no longer effective. And consequently, there's fewer opportunities for organisational learning within these organisations then. So I love this quote from one of my colleagues who's now retired, where he informs us that the inherited identity of unions shapes the directions of union renewal because they rarely overturn their past character and purpose. So it's a lovely quote. Within unions, particularly those long established, the widespread respect for precedent and protocol means that the traditions of all the dead generations frequently inhibit learning. And I think too often in organising practice, the knowledge about strategy and tactics and power is drawn from too narrow a pool of similar leaders, leading to a replication of ineffective strategy and tactics. So, okay, so moving on to the current day then, and I'll finish in a minute. So one of the great strengths of the union movement at the moment is the new independent unions, and I'm not overemphasising these. I accept that these are very, very small unions at the moment, but the Independent Workers of Great Britain and United Voices of the World. What's interesting about these new unions that have formed is that they started off within the mainstream unions, mainly organising. They were mainly migrant workers, mainly organising around migrant worker issues, but didn't feel there was a place for them in those unions. So came out of those unions and established these small independent unions. And what's interesting about them is that their leaders are from many diverse cultures and backgrounds. And I think it's the very different lived experience of their members which is innovative and is giving rise to different ways of thinking about organising. So the lack of adherence to particular forms of action has taken employers by surprise. They're less constrained by traditional industrial action. They're more nimble. They are able to draw on their diverse culture of their membership to innovate. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with Saul Alinsky, who said in his book, wherever possible, go outside the expertise of your adversary. Find ways to increase insecurity, anxiety, and uncertainty, because power is not only what you have, it's what the enemy thinks that you have. And if you can surprise them by taking unexpected actions, then you change the power dynamic. So, and I think, from this, it requires a sort of, not just a diverse and strategic leadership, it also requires a sort of learning and reflexive culture within organisations. And again, I'm not sure many of our unions would, even think about reflexive culture within their organisations. So, okay, just a couple of points to finish then. I just want to talk very, very briefly about the use of political education. And I mentioned at the start, I'm involved in the Ella Baker School of Organising. And I want to talk about the use of political education and trade unions. In the past, many trade unions provided political education, which was designed to equip union stewards to become workplace leaders who were able to articulate injustice and exploitation, but beyond that of the bread and butter issues in the workplace. So political education really gave union reps the capacity to initiate a wider examination of class politics and the power dynamics in unions, but also in society as well, and beyond the employment relationship. It offered this space for discussion of ideas and tactics about building power. But I think a lot of the training around organising frequently ignores the sort of peer-to-peer organising teaching, the political context of trade unions, the role of the vested interests that undermine our efforts. And in truth, I think what most trade unions here, again, I don't know what it's like in the States, I'd be interested to find out, what many trade unions are providing is not education, but it's skills-based training. It delivers that sort of toolbox of tactics, which can be deployed in the same way in every circumstance. But I think what's really needed is a form of political education which is open up to members, not just union reps, that helps to think about, what's going on in wider society. How do we build a strategic capacity, that helps to sort of, fuel grassroots activism and create effective change. So without political education that develops this sort of critical thinking, that ability to assess the successes and failures of the past and the present, then I think workers are left without a vision of a credible path forward in terms of winning. And then consequently, I think they're left without hope. And then they become detached from the labour movement. Anyway, so just to finish then, going back to this quote from Flanders, unions need organisation and their power and movement and their vitality, but they need both their power and vitality to enhance their social purpose. And I think, he was arguing that trade unions need to be much more dynamic membership organisations if power is to be maintained beyond a sort of fleeting existence. Yet to me, I think in the current economic, social and political climate, it seems to me that there are at least possibilities for union resurgence if there's a vision of unionism that includes that much wider social purpose that can excite and energise people well beyond the current ranks of people. I think the history and formation of the trade union movement is inextricably linked to the places and spaces where people lived and worked. And, I sort of mentioned this at the beginning. It meant that workers in communities were bound together in a way that I think is probably less the case than it is today. And I think that's what Hobsbawm was trying to say in his article about the fracturing of the working class. This is a quote from a trade union historian, where he observed that trade unions until the 19th century occupied a much more central place in the associational life of their members, where they would engage in self-help initiatives outside of the workplace and in the communities in which they belonged. And I think, what's happened over time is that unions become much more inward-looking and more focused on servicing their, current membership rather than looking outwards into the wider community. Okay, but then, I'll finish on this. I think there real are hopes and new possibilities for trade union expansion, but only if there's a willingness to take on board some of the issues that I've mentioned. And I just wanted to highlight this to finish, because when we went into the first lockdown in 2020 during the COVID crisis, there was a massive rapid development of mutual aid groups that formed across the UK in a matter of weeks to help people who were isolating at home. Tens of thousands of people in voluntary groups, came together to support vulnerable and shielding neighbours. And it was this large-scale mobilisation. It's at the very heart of, what is good about people in terms of sort of, support and caring for people outside their own, family. So it showed to me that individualism that we've been taught about, that, everybody's in it for themselves, there's no such thing as society, which is what Margaret Thatcher said at one point. Actually, I don't think that's the case. We've seen that people will respond when they're given something, when they've, there's something that they can respond to, and about working together. That human instinct about reaching out and working together is something that I think is there. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. And maybe we've got some questions here we can have a discussion on, but I'm happy to take any sort of questions that you have, any comments that you have, any thoughts you have, any disagreements you have with me. So let's just open it up and have a discussion on those things. Let me just stop sharing.
Thank you, Jane. Very good.
I hope I didn't talk for too long.
No, it was a very good PowerPoint as well. I'm glad you took the time to be careful to select good images. It really helps with PowerPoints. So welcome. A few people have joined since Jane began, and now the floor is open for questions, comments, and please write the word. Oh, Alana Lee, you're in stack. Go ahead.
Hi, Jane. Thank you for very interesting. I don't. Maybe this is more of a comment or just something that I was thinking about while you were talking, and I think your book is really, which I don't have a copy of, but is really forward-looking. But you did bring up the history, at least in the UK, of unions and trade union movements. And my orientation is always, I read a lot of literature, and from reading novels and literature, there's often a spark that leads me to look further into history. And lately I've been reading a novel by a Scottish writer, Douglas Stewart. And the book is it's a very personal story in the book, but it's set in Glasgow in like the very early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And it describes how the shipbuilding industry was basically decimated in the beginning times of Thatcher. And it doesn't really talk about it just talks about the intense poverty and the anger by these now unemployed shipbuilders. So I started doing a little bit of looking into it, not that much, but apparently there was a union organizer who was very powerful, also a member of the CP, who did something apparently he tried to do in the late 70s when the shipbuilding industry was shutting down. He tried to do a work-in where instead of going out on strike, the workers went into and I just started looking into this. But when you talked about innovative ways of dealing with, the crisis of unions being, basically, pulled apart, taken apart and using power. I just thought that was interesting in terms of what seems to me, at least in this country, for me, there's very little known history of what this organizer, who I guess was somewhat polarizing, possibly because he was in the Communist Party. I wonder if you knew anything about that, had any comments about it. It just seemed interesting to me to have a work-in instead of a strike out, you know.
Yeah,
it was
I mean,
unsuccessful, clearly, because the shipbuilding industry died completely, but...
Yeah, but the Upper Clyde, it was in the Upper Clyde shipyards, and they did indeed sit in, and it's one of those sort of things anybody who knows about UK labour history knows the story of the Upper Clyde shipworkers, because they were really successful, and they did save the shipyards in the end. I mean, they didn't save them right to the current day, but they did at that time because they were going to be closed down. But it is a fascinating story of how they came together, because they did build support from the wider community. They could not have managed it without building the support for the wider community as well. So they occupied and they ran the shipyards themselves. And because they weren't prepared, because once your shipyard starts to shut down, it's really difficult to get it back up in place again. So they said, we're not going to go out on strike. We're going to stay here. We're going to show that we can do this work. We can show that we can be disciplined workers, and we'll carry on doing the work. And they were just incredibly well organised. You know, the CP was much stronger then than it is today. But there was incredible discipline from the workers in terms of, you know, doing that. And it's a really important tactic. I have a book on my shelf on the Upper Clyde ship workers. So if I get a moment, I'll run to my shelf and I'll put it in the chat box.
Yeah, it was very interesting to me because from, you know, I don't know much about labor history, and I'm in the US anyway, but I thought, wow, this was like the background for this novel that it was written in 2020. I guess won a Booker Prize, which is why I was reading it. It's a very sad story. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to follow this and look into it because it seems fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, yeah.
David?
Thanks. That's actually very helpful and interesting presentation. Touched on so many things that have bothered me for someone who, you know, has some history also when I was young, the labor movement work. And I go back to, what do you think unions should be organizing for? Since you posed that question in your last spreadsheet, I'm very interested in this question of how, you know, in its origins, the labor movement was not only about collective bargaining, or even initially so much about collective bargaining as it was about self-help, and workers getting together and doing things in order to better their conditions where they were. And there was certainly a lot of that here in the United States. And at one time, unions had, because they set up medical clinics with their own doctors and things, because we had no national health. We still don't have a national health system in the United States, really. They had educational, institutions that actually help people, for example, get their high school diplomas and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of that fell away because it's true after the New Deal, to some extent, through collective bargaining. For example, employers started being forced to give medical insurance as part of the employment benefits. The GI Bill made higher education available to so many people, and the growth of state universities. Now, all that's kind of come undone in the period since the same period that you're talking about, since the 1970s and 1980s. A lot of those things have come undone, but of course, the union movement just kind of frittered away, dissipated during that period, and now there's sort of nobody to pick up the slack. But I don't see, at least the big unions in the United States, such as they are, I don't see any of them being in a position to return into that, to play that role. I mean, they're basically set up as collective bargaining business organizations. That's what they do.
Yeah. I suppose, there's several answers to this. You know, I've been doing some research with Unite, which is the largest largest union in the UK, the private sector union. And about 12 years ago, they created an initiative, set up a section within the union, which they called Unite Community. And this was a membership that was open to people who were not in employment. So this included retirees, students, carers, people who are working, people who are at home and doing social care, and anybody who was not in work. And in a sense, it appeared quite an odd initiative at the time, but they rapidly built membership. And it's still not massive. It's only about 20,000 members, but there's about 50 groups across the country. And what the people who've joined those organisations have done so for a whole range of reasons. One is that, we know from surveys that have been done in the UK that, there's a massive amount of voluntary work done by people in general, whether that's been charities or, scouts or environmental stuff or whatever. And Unite Community is a way of tapping into this and saying, well, if you're active in your community, why not do that through the umbrella of the trade union movement? So you can organise around whatever issues you are. And they've tended to organise around things like benefit cuts, welfare advice, that sort of thing. But they've also been a sort of almost like a little reserve army of picketers when there's been industrial disputes in their area. And so these groups have been set up and, they've been incredibly successful and really supportive for workers when they've been out on strike. So there's that sort of initiative taking place, which I think could be much, much bigger. I can't really I've not got time to go into the details of why it's not as big as it might be. But one of the reasons is that the union doesn't open up that membership to its industrial members, to its 1.4 million industrial members. You can only join that part of the union if you're not in work. And I think that's strange. Why not allow all your 1.4 million members who are not really active, why not give them a place to be active within their communities through the Unite membership? And I think it could really help to open up the not only Unite's membership, but actually get people more active within their unions. So there's that thing, but there's a Chicago teachers strike. I think again, connecting. This wasn't just about the self-interest of the teachers, it was connecting to what was going on in terms of funding, as far as I understand it, of schools, but also what was going on in schools, class sizes and things like that. So they connected what they were doing, not just in terms of the self-interest in terms of wages. It was about actually this is a broader issue for the wider community. It's not just, and I think if unions can, again, it goes back to what I was talking about, sort of discursive power and thinking about how we frame our disputes. If we can frame these in different ways, so they are much broader, they don't appear to just be the self-interest of workers. Not that there's anything wrong with the self-interest of workers, but if they can reframe them in such a way that they connect with a wider audience, then I think, unions would do so much better. I think that's what I think unions should be organising for, as well as on the industrial front as well.
So Carol Ann has written her question. She actually now has two in the chat. The first part is Frances Fox Piven. The reason Carol Ann is not asking is she's in Vancouver and there are internet, actually Victoria Island off the coast of Vancouver, but she has internet issues, so she can't ask, but she can type. So Frances Fox Piven talked a lot about disruptive power. What are your thoughts on this form of power, and how is it similar or different from the forms of power you presented, or perhaps how disruptive power is integral or not to the 6 forms of power you highlighted? Thank you. Carol Ann, I think we'll come back to your second question because there's a lot to address in your first one. So go ahead, Jane.
I don't know, to be honest. I haven't really thought a lot about disruptive power in the sense that I think, I wouldn't necessarily think of disruptive power as a sort of form of power on its own. I think all forms of power can be disruptive. So I'm not quite sure whether there's something distinct as disruptive power. Maybe Frances Fox Prison, has made an argument around that, but I don't know because I haven't actually read about that. But I think, I suppose I would say that all the forms of power that I was talking about are potentially disruptive, because at the heart of what power is, it is a disruptive relationship, isn't it? Somebody's got more power than you have, and you're attempting to rebalance that power relationship. So I'm not sure that's a good answer to your question, but maybe somebody else maybe have some thoughts about that.
Caroline, are you able to speak to it a little more, or no internet? Is the internet not strong enough?
I mean, we can move on to the second question about trust. And again, I'm not sure, I'm necessarily the best person to answer this, but I would say the bigger the unions have got, there seems to be so much less trust between the leadership and the rank and file of workers. I think because they are so far apart. Just thinking in terms of my own union, as I was saying earlier, we've been in dispute now for the last sort of year or so. I've just taken 39 days of strike action. And there's been a real debate within the union about the voice of the rank and file and the leadership positions, and the difference between the messages that come from the leadership and the messages that come from the rank and file, and there not being the sort of voice that people need. And of course, you can argue that, well, people should be more involved in their branches and stuff, but structurally, the bigger unions are, the more difficult it is for people, at the rank and file to get their voices heard, I think. And I think that does create a whole issue of trust. And we're now seeing it within our own union in terms of now we're discussing the tactics we're going to take next, and people feeling that their voice is not being heard because, various committees are making those decisions, and people are talking about, well, I don't trust what's being said there, so I'm just going to leave the union. And I think there's real problems in terms of the structure of unions and the interaction between the different layers within them. But I'm interested to hear from other people about what their unions are like.
So, Peter King, go ahead. You need to unmute, Peter.
There. This is more of a reminisce than anything else, but it's prompted by some of the points that were made in the talk, which I found very interesting and I thought was very useful. I am just old enough to remember when Mike Quill was the most powerful man in New York. So, Ms. Holgate, you mentioned a time when TUC leaders were prominent and right up there with the government. And I remember when the head of the Transport Workers Union here in New York was able to shut the city down. That's a long time ago now. But I remember it because it happened, and I also remember it because my father was in the TWU. So I think I remember him being out on strike at the time. Anyway, time passes and we come around to 2005 and the TWU goes out on strike again with somewhat less success than they had in 1965, I think it was. And you mentioned correctly that anti-labor laws need not stop unions from concerted activity. By the time 2005 came along, we had a law here in New York State called the Taylor Law, which forbids strikes by public sector employees. They did it anyway. Toussaint was able to get a deal, although it was kind of a measly deal, and wound up in prison, and the union was fined millions of dollars as a result of it. So that was kind of a sad outcome. I'm not arguing against the idea, but I am sort of saying that there were consequences to this. It would be nice, though, if the unions could regain their kind of spirit. The TWU is an industrial union, so they command a lot of people in a lot of different sectors of transport. One thing I remember about the 2005 strike was I saw on television the head of the workers for Metro North, which is a commuter line here in New York, actually said on screen, maybe we'll strike in sympathy with the TWU. And for 1 second, I thought, my God, it's going to happen. You know, it's all going to come to a stop. And now we're going to learn where the power is. And then he didn't do it. And that's illegal too, by the way. Sympathy strikes are illegal here in the States. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of history here in New York, which chimes in very well with some of the topics you raised in the talk.
Yeah, I mean, that point about sympathy strikes and secondary action, secondary picketing, you know, was so valuable and so important to unions in the 50s, 60s and 70s. But it was precise because it was so powerful, you know, that anti-union legislation, you know, made that impossible. And we saw, you know, massive support, particularly from mine workers and other workers, you know, using secondary action. But, you know, it was one of the things that the Thatcher government did when it came in. It was like one of the first things it did to outlaw secondary picketing. And I think, you know, the government and the state was incredibly strategic in its thinking through about how to undermine workers' power. And I think we've been less capable or able to think about strategic use of power in the way that they have. They planned for a long time in terms of to attack our power in the labour unions. And, you know, we just haven't spent the time thinking strategically, thinking of how we might outmaneuver them. They've outmaneuvered us extremely well, but we've not managed to, you know, to do that the other way around. Yeah, so David's just saying crippling fines against unions. Yeah. Yeah, and of course we had that in the UK, particularly during the 1984-85 miners' strike, where, you know, the union funds were sequestrated. But, you know, there's ways around these things by, you know, setting up different organisations and being much more nimble. The small unions are managing to do, you know, to win in ways that, you know, the large unions are not, just because they are so much more nimble and can get around some of the, you know, the obstacles in the way.
So, Jane, last week, a week ago Saturday, we had a Pluto author, by the way, by the name of Rob McKenzie, who spoke on his book, El Golpe, on the CIA, Ford Motor, and the UAW, and the coup of the Mexican auto workers who were on strike. And I haven't read the book because they're slow. With the supply crisis, the books are hard to get out to people like us. In any case, the UAW was very integrated with the CIA's effort to disrupt the auto workers organizing right across the border, instead of being in solidarity with those workers and having a real international auto workers union. The UAW in many ways worked with the CIA to make sure the union would not establish and that the organization would be crushed. Then this morning I get up and I see where in the north of Ireland, the Brexiteers have a little roadblock now with Sinn Féin taking the election. And the analysis, I don't know about the Guardian's analysis, but it was talking about many of the Protestant and Catholic workers in Northern Ireland are going through the same very difficult austerity that may be the worst in all of the UK, and that there is talk of joint action around Labour there. However, the Tories will probably rule against this, as they do every time Labour organizes. In the end, capital will always be putting up obstacles to workers organizing. And we have to have organizations strong enough to defy this, no matter what they are. And I feel that in many ways, like in your slideshow, it was very visible that by the 70s, photos of workers gathered were no longer all white or all one gender. We have an international working class as varied as ever before, with many common interests. And I feel that in some ways, besides doing the local organizing on your campus or your high school or your factory, we need to be reaching out across borders and getting support from wherever we can in the world. Just like today, this is not a great example, but our Zoom is covering 3 continents, right? Or 3 large countries, Canada, US, and the UK. We have had moments like this where we have people from 17 countries. And I don't know what will happen. My take on it, having grown up in the midst of the Detroit area, where the UAW was very strong, but many other unions were strong as well, and they've been weakened quite a bit, is that as soon as Wayne State, Cornell, and University of Michigan graduated a few thousand industrial relations people who never worked on the shop floors or at the high schools, and they became the administrators and negotiators, there was no realistic approach to what the workers needed or wanted. And when it became overly bureaucratized and set according to textbooks, that was besides capital's austerity, which was fierce with Reagan, Thatcher, etc. The same bureaucratization gave capital tremendous strength against unions as well. And I don't know where to turn that around, because so many people I meet in the labor movement never worked the shop floor. They all are from these schools. They're from industrial relations schools. So now, as faculty members or students who are adjunct faculty, while they're doing their postgraduate, they are probably in need of their own unions now, so may get some shop floor experience in that way. But how are we going to, in a sense, get many people who think of themselves as middle class, even when they're left, how are we going to get the understanding on a broad way that we are all in this fight together and need to support each other? That's a very big question for you.
That is a very big question. But I think it goes back to the point that I was making about the diversity of leadership and getting people from, involving people from all sorts of backgrounds. You look at our union movement, and the phrase that was often used about the union movement, that it was pale, male, and stale. It was white, it was elderly, it was male. It has changed considerably, but, it needs to change an awful lot more. We need that diversity of experience in order to, I'm a trade union rep and I represent my members. But what people are often saying to me is like, the union just looks not like me. And that's something that we need to change, and we need to get more. We need to open up our spaces to have people to discuss things in different ways. And I think one of the things that holds back our unions changing is the structure of our unions. People will often say, well, you have to come along to a branch meeting to have an opinion. You think, well, fine, of course, that's important in terms of union democracy, but we could set up all sorts of different, more ad hoc structures to get people involved, to encourage people to talk at a rank and file level about their issues so that they're much more heard. And I think, if unions could do more work in that area, then it would get more people actually actively involved in playing different roles and having different ideas. Because, I know in my own union, we rely on doing things the same way as we've always done them. We'll take strike action. Well, is strike action actually going to work at this moment? Are we in a position where we can actually affect any change? What is the leverage that we have? Just by continually doing what we've done before and hoping that it will change next time, for me, is not the way forward. We have to think much more strategically about how we approach whatever actions that we're doing. And sometimes we're in a mindset of thinking, well, this is what I've always done. This is how we've always done it. It takes people coming at it from a different perspective, different cultural backgrounds, whatever, who might think, actually, I could draw upon my lived experience. effect some change in which is why we see from the smaller unions, the independent unions here in the UK, punching way beyond their weight and their size in terms of having an influence and changing for their members that is happening with the larger unions. And I think if we could draw upon some of the ways that they organise, we could actually, really start to change some of the structures in our unions. And hopefully once we change some of the structures, we actually become much more dynamic. But yeah, we're a long way from that, I think.
Thanks, Jane. Michael Pelias. You need to unmute, Michael.
Yes, thank you very much for a very eloquent talk on power, especially. My question involves organizing contingent labor. In the United States, as Michael pointed out, most of the teaching, I'm in the teaching machine, and I've been on a year-to-year contract for many years as a philosophy professor. And, I've been very active in union struggles. I created an alliance of unions in New York City in higher education that never really got off the ground, but there were people very interested to come together. In the United States, statistically, over 75% of teaching in the university level is done by adjunct labor, by contingent labor. This is a source that has not been tapped into at all by any of the AFT, the AAUP, the UFT, all of these, top-heavy bureaucratic unions. And I think Michael Lardner pointed out something very interesting that is extremely under-theorized. How did we get a generation of professional, quote-unquote, professionalized union organizers from Cornell School of Labor Relations, Wayne State, Michigan, Ann Arbor, et cetera? And how much does that really hurt the movement for people that really don't know the ground up? So, I know we don't have an answer to this, but this seems to be an incredibly, vibrant, vital, and highly exploited critical mass that is just waiting to be organized. We see a little bit of this in the Amazon, who is a person not in education with Christopher Smalls. It seems to me that you need this kind of groundswell if there's any hope for unions at this point. You need more than Saul Alinsky, in a sense, to really build towards the future. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about this, about how do we go about organizing contingency? So, for example, I have worked after a disastrous contract, after being, demonized, scapegoated, et cetera, for the last 5 years at my university to get 2 contingent members of the faculty, elected to union positions. We're going to have a president who's contingent labor, and we're going to have a treasurer, 2 key positions in the union who are very much ground level fighters, right? But this is going on at very small, very little places, and really part of the exclusion. And to go back to what Peter King said, there's a group at the PSC, the Professional Staff Congress, that are willing to break the Taylor Law, to go against it, willing to go on strike at this point, to send a message that there is a generation of lawbreakers, so to speak, that might be, put themselves on the line this way. I know the penalties involved, but why not go for the strong box, just not pay the penalties, and everybody go to jail or something? I'm fantasizing here, but anyway, something to go about. But just to go back to, how do you see the organization of contingency? I'm obviously very interested in strategy and power, and how that powerful group from the base can really happen. And more, it's not only in education, it's in, all fields, from, movie making, photography, craft labor, skilled, unskilled labor. So much of this is contingent at this point, more and more towards that direction. And of course, globally, as we all know. Yeah. So that to me seems to be the big, the explosive, group of agency that we really should be looking at. Yeah.
Yeah. So you make some very important points there. And, I could talk about my experience in higher education here in the UK, where we've got something like 40% of our, teaching staff as contingent workers. But what's interesting about the dispute, so we've been in dispute now for like 2 years over several issues. One is pensions. They're trying to cut our pensions significantly. But the one that's the other dispute is we term the four fights, and this is to do with equalities issues, it's to do with pay, it's to do with workload, but importantly, it's to do with precarious working and casualisation. And it's actually this issue, which is casualisation and workload are the two big issues which have been pushing people. And we've seen that actually it's the contingent workers who've been at the centre of this fight within the union over this issues and really pushing it forward. And I think that, you know, the issue for me, and I think for them, is that in the sense that they feel like, well, we've got nothing to lose. We're always on precarious contracts. We've been on precarious contracts for so long. And the more there is of us, actually, the more strength that we have, in the sense that, you know, we can't easily be replaced because, you know, we have become the majority in the workplace. So we're actually seeing, and it's not just in the case of higher education, but in terms of other disputes that we've seen here in the UK, and it's also the case, I think, in the US as well, but it is some of the most precarious of workers that have been taking action, the people who are working in the gig economy, the delivery drivers, the Amazon drivers, all sorts of different workers in the gig economy. And I think, again, they think, particularly because of the labour market at the moment, don't know whether it's the same in the US, but here in the UK, there's, you know, since Brexit, and so many Europeans left to the UK and went back into other parts of Europe, there's a skill shortage and a labour shortage. And so, you know, that works to the advantage of people, and they can say, well, I can organise here. If I get sacked, if I lose my job, I can just walk into another job the next day, you know. So I think, you know, when circumstances change like that, there's more opportunities for, you know, for unions to organise. But I would also say that I think what we need to do more of is to organise in terms of to build up our union density, because in terms of our dispute in higher education, we don't have high density. We have higher density than lots of the private sector, but, you know, we're talking about the figures around about 30 or 40% union density. But it's not enough to extract the leverage from the employers in order to make them change their mind in terms of, you know, attacking our pensions or our terms and conditions. So that, to use, you know, Jane McAlevy's phrase, there are no shortcuts. We have to organise in order to build up our union densities to such an extent that actually it makes it much more difficult for employers to say no to us. And we can't do that, I think, without spending a lot of time thinking, okay, what are the issues that our members care more about? How can we build our union membership around that? And, you know, these are things that take years to do. You can't just build membership and density, you know, in the short term. I think it needs those long strategic plans about how you involve people within the unions and how you continue to build. And I think we can't do that without, you know, spending a lot of time on actual, you know, grassroots organising.
Jane and Michael, I want to intervene a little bit. Was it 6 years ago already, Michael, that the students supported the strike at LIU?
Yes, it was, 2016 was the lockout, September of 2016, Labor Day weekend, actually. You know, they announced it 2 days before there's going to be a lockout. And then the students began to support, yes, during the lockout. It was a 2-week, you know, integrated moment with the students. The problem is the faculty, you know, capitulated. This is really the problem. There was a militant group of people, you know, there was a 35% who would not ratify a new contract. Most people lived under the illusion that they were under risk or being fired, even though a continued contract, you know, under the old bargaining agreement would have resulted in them staying, especially the tenure track people, not the people that were on contingent, contracts, et cetera. So yes, been that long, and the students joined. They let our teachers teach was one slogan. We had tremendous media presence, and I thought we had a really historical movement, but it fizzled out because I think what Jane mentioned earlier, and this to me is one of the most important parts of all of this today, is political education. You had a bunch of, excuse my language, a systematic moronization, as Marcuse said, of the public, right? And it's going on constantly, and everybody was into it for their self-interest. What is this in it for me? Instead of seeing that this was an opportunity to really raise the question, is education for the educators, or is it for a bunch of pencil pushers that now judge class size by algorithmic governmentality? So this to me is, yeah. So we're 5 years later. We have like I said, we now have, after 5 years of, sweetheart rubbing elbows and, a complete decimation of the university, trying to rebuild, et cetera. Class sizes have been, increased. The enrollment at the institution is way down. So it's a horrible situation. So we're building from ground zero, right, in many ways. And I'm hoping for the best. I mean, you know me.
Well, Michael, the reason I brought it up is that here was a real example of not just the student body, but the general public across the entire political spectrum had empathy for the union activities. And I don't know what it was within the union structure, if it was individuals who were in the union and only being opportunistic with it and had no real class basis in terms of their orientation. But I think that that history is still very interesting and important. And how did the students come along in such a mass way to support the union at their time of need? So that type of communication is a great model, I think, for being different than the way we did these things before.
Yeah. And I think, what's happened here in the dispute, in the higher education dispute, is we have got students on side and got them supporting us, joining our picket lines. But we also ran a whole series of what we term teach outs. So, we taught subjects that we're not allowed to teach in our normal classes. So we had some great teach outs where we said, actually, this is what a good education could be like, a more interesting way, which is not tied to exams and assessments and all that sort of stuff. So we ran those to engage with students. So they were jointly run with students, and students did some of those as well. And it is about political education. I think it is a huge neglected area within labour unions. We don't do political education anymore, and it is a real shame. But it also has a massive impact on the sort of leaders that we have within our unions. You get people to think more broadly about the issues. It's not just about bread and butter issues. It's about societal change. So that was the point I wanted to make about that, and I've forgotten what else I was going to say because my train of thought was gone. So sorry about that.
Yeah, when you speak of political education, you mentioned the Chicago Teachers Union. They had study groups, and Karen Lewis herself was part of a study group that read Georgie Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. So this is something that is very, very important, lacking in most unions. No study groups, et cetera. And as we all know, most of the unions are really about the wage and benefit package, never about building the culture, as you mentioned very, well. And talking about. And
the times are a-changing, are they not? We hope.
I'm sorry?
The times are a-changing.
Yeah. Right.
I look at things like in Indonesia, where in '65, the U.S. with the Indonesians killed 500,000 leftists. And just 2 years ago, there were 500,000 people out on strike in essentially the same country without a major shift in its politics. But those workers defied, and really, you don't get that. It was not like in India where you see the general strikes of 300 million people that shut the entire country down. But that's all one party with control of those workers. In Indonesia, it was a cross-spectrum movement, and we are seeing this kind of thing happening in the world. And that doesn't just erupt out of nowhere. There has been some heavy-duty organizing and other ways going on to have that type of moment take place. But
well, Michael, you mentioned earlier about sort of, you know, the internationalization of sort of thought and organizing. I don't know whether any of you have been following or taking part in Organizing for Power, the online Zoom sessions. Anybody been involved in these? They're run by the Rosa Luxemburg Institute in Berlin and Jane McAlevey. Of course, many of you will be aware of her work on.
Can you put that in chat somehow?
I will do, yeah, just when I finish speaking. But so I've done several of these courses, and they run over about 5 or 6 weeks. But the last session that I was on was a year back, and it had about 4,000 or 5,000 people from about 100 different countries, with 10 simultaneous interpretation taking place, and breakout groups. So you went along to this not as an individual, you went along with your union branch, maybe 3 or 4 people from your union branch, and you worked through the course to think about strategy and power and how you have these difficult conversations with workers, etc., etc. But it's fascinating because people from all over the world were feeding back about, you know, their own issues and what they'd learned from other people. It's just a wonderful thing to be, you know, to be on a call on a whole series of sort of training sessions with people, so many people from across the world, all learning the same things and how to apply them, and then getting feedback because it was run again. And some people who went on the course then came back and said, we've taken what we've learned from the course and applied it in our workplace. And this is this is how we have won our dispute. You know, so there was a wonderful report back from a group of workers, hospital workers in Berlin, who'd taken everything that they learned, you know, applied it and won their dispute against all odds. So yeah, I'll put the I'll find a link, and if I can't find it now, I'll send it to you later, and you can circulate it.
You need a good editor. This should be streaming on Netflix. You know?
Indeed, yes.
I'm looking at chat. Do you want to say that current global thing, Alana, or is that just a chat comment?
Well, I'm fearful of what I see is clearly a rise of neo-fascist movements globally, and I don't think, I mean, you know, one of the tenets of fascism in the 20s and 30s, besides anti-Semitism, was the, you know, suppression of any kind of working class organizing movement. So I see it as a fearful moment in history, and I think that it'll be difficult. That's all.
Well, then Carol Ann, because she is having weather problems, can you talk a little bit about the role of political parties and union power? Here in Canada, trade unions do not have an alliance with the political party. They tend to change support depending on what each party is offering. With the left-leaning party like the NDP, they will support centrist and right-leaning parties. And then she says she agrees with Alana's comment. So I'm just getting you both that international movement, how do we counter the right, and then some of what Carol Ann, if you could take that on, Jane, it's quite a bit.
Yeah, well, that's a big one. I mean, clearly it's different here in the UK because the union movement formed the Labour Party, and as historically all had a strong link with the Labour Party. But I think that became problematic in the sense that, you know, it contracted out its politics to the Labour Party, and it thought, okay, we'll just deal with the industrial, they'll deal with the politics. And of course, you know, the Labour movement, so the Labour government moved to a centre ground and, you know, didn't oppose or didn't rescind the anti-trade union laws. So, you know, it's now the disconnect is far more, even though formally, you know, trade unions, many trade unions are still affiliated to the Labour Party and give vast amounts of money, but seemingly get little in return for it. I think that sort of model is more or less redundant in the sense that, the Labour movement doesn't really get much for its involvement with the Labour Party. I'm not really sure what more to add. I mean, it's a huge discussion, isn't it? So I think yeah.
Something we're all facing, yes.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, David Worley, you're on stack. Go ahead.
Actually, I'd like to bring up the question. It's kind of related to that. It's going in from the different direction. We do see that sometimes working class struggles rise up kind of spontaneously totally out of the context of places where we expect them to. But of course, always the politics of those struggles is not always just like what all of us would feel comfortable with. I'm really, since you're geographically closer, although that doesn't mean that you know more about it, could you say something about the Gilets jaunes phenomenon in France from a couple of years ago, and which on the one hand seemed like this kind of amazing challenge to the Macron government's neoliberal, complacent neoliberal policies, but on the other hand, it sometimes involved at least elements that were in some ways seemed quite reactionary on certain issues.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really know much in terms of whether there was a relationship between the movement and the labour unions. I mean, obviously the labour movement.
I don't think there was very much.
Yeah. But then again, I suppose the question is why was that the case? Why is it? Is it again that labour unions just think, well, we'll just think industrially, we won't think politically, and look for wider change because we don't want to be seen as political, either tied to a political party or tied to politics in more general. Is that a failure of unions overall? I think it probably is. I think you can't divorce people's, working conditions from what's going on in wider society. The fact that we're being hit by, massive inflation at the moment is something that affects people's wages. But actually, you have to think about it in the context of what is going on. Why is it happening? The war in Ukraine, the impact that's having on, and across Europe. So I think you can't just deal with industrial issues without thinking about, why you're facing the conditions that you're facing. I think it's too short-termism just to think in terms of industrial issues rather than wider political ones.
Well, in a sense, Jane, I find that this has been a great talk because we do need to figure out how to have the broadest political understanding amongst union membership, and aspiring union members, the rest of the working class. We have no choice but to have broad-based political education. I wish that I hope it's broader based than today's 10 of us. There have been 10 of us in and out all day today. And my apologies for not checking this on Mother's Day. But that's.
I think it's not just Mother's Day. I think that there are a lot of demonstrations in our neck of the woods on about what's happening with reproductive rights in this country. So I know there's every day there's a demonstration and people are involved in that as well. They should be. So
there have been demos every day, even in our town.
Yeah, it's horrendous. Yeah.
But I find that I really want to get the copy of this book, Jane. I like the way Pluto designs their covers, but your cover is particularly good and simple. It is simple and yet a proclamation that we need to not just organize, but we have to educate ourselves and really understand what capital is all about, especially since capital seems willing to go down these endgame moments without resolving any of the glaring contradictions that are looking at our species. We have to become as audacious with understanding as they are without understanding, but just their acquisitiveness. So
I'm just going to post this link in the chat. You just had the Rosa Luxemburg and the Organising for Power. Yeah, there it is. Take a look at that.
And at that link, we'll be able to get record. We will find the actual recording.
You will find some clips. I don't think you'll find the whole recording of it, but you will find some clips. And I think, you know, there will be more strike schools coming up, and anybody can register for these. So just take a look at it. Yeah.
Great. I already cut and pasted it into my notes on today.
Great. Yeah.
Oh, so David's pointing out yet one other thing, and this is where we as a left community should be doing all we can. Do you want to speak to that, David? I don't want to read your comment out loud. Can you do so?
Well, just at the beginning, before most people came in, there was, we talked briefly about how wonderful that election of the Amazon Workers Union winning collective bargaining rights at this warehouse in Staten Island. But before we get too, you know, giddy about it, should realize Amazon is refusing to engage with them. They've gone to court, claimed that the election was not legitimate. I think it's frivolous litigation, but that kind of litigation they can drag it on for years, refusing to bargain and hoping that the people that support the union they can push them out, or they will just leave, get tired, and in the end, you know, be back to square one. And that's a very common way that the United States companies that are opposed to recognizing, that don't want to recognize unions in their workplaces, defeat them is literally by dragging the whole process out through a combination of litigation, selective firings, and so forth for years until the whole thing peters out.
Well, they've been doing that since 1820, David. Capital has always been doing that kind of thing.
Well, I don't know. The trouble is that they seem to have resources. You know, in the old days, people would go on strike if they, which is theoretically, I suppose, what I don't know what their legal rights are to go on strike if they don't have. Well, they could go on strike, but then what happens is then Amazon can fire the strikers and try and put in replacements without a bigger movement supporting them. They just become isolated. I don't want to be. I'm saying this only to just point out the kinds of obstacles we face to this kind of workplace organizing in the absence of a larger political movement.
I understand. Yes.
I agree with that analysis. That was my thoughts as well about that. It's, you know, I think the figure for Amazon, the money that Amazon has spent fighting this is something like £43 million, isn't it? You know, in terms.
Yeah, in the old days, a company, even a big industrial company, would sort of hesitate to just throw immense amounts of money into fighting. They say, "Oh, it's cheaper for us to recognize the union and collective bargaining." We have someone like Bezos. He apparently doesn't care about any financial consideration. You know, it's one plant out of many around the world, and doesn't matter to him.
But again, I think you know, workers have got to think more strategically. You know, about, you know, what can we do if we can't strike? What else can we do? You know, and I know the mass sickie, you know, is something that hasn't really taken off, but people all calling in sick on a day, you know, has worked in other places where they've not been able to strike. It's just people just don't turn up for a day because they just phone in sick. We've got to think about, you know, different ways of getting our message across and using the power that we have.
Michael's had his hand up. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael Lardner that, you know, the war of attrition has been fought since day one in terms of any kind of labor uprising. The task is to figure out creative ways to make people not get tired, not give up, et cetera, because that's always the problem, how the fear becomes administered, how the frustration leads to tiredness, giving up, et cetera. And to me, again, this is a failure of the AFL, the big teachers unions, SEIU, et cetera. You can go down the list. These are very, very solvent unions. These are, minor, corporations in some ways that have big bankrolls and could be really involved in these kind of struggles in a very active way, in a sense. And it seems to me that that's where we should be going to talk to those members or the people in power there to put themselves behind these kind of movements led by, a person that doesn't even have a college degree or whatever. Probably an advantage to him, to Christopher Smalls at Amazon or other people that, have done these kind of grassroots, these kind of revolution from below activities. Because if you can't support this and keep this off the ground, you might as well just wash your hands. I mean, and say it's over in a sense. We're always going to be, in this collective bargaining, like my friend Aronowitz wrote 50 years ago, false promises. Here we go again, the failures of collective bargaining, collective begging. That's where we end up in all of this. So that, at least that's my feeling about this. How do you reach out if you're going to organize in the power? Go to the powers that be in the union movements that are very flush with cash. I mean, I look at the dues structures, et cetera. Yeah. And how much money they have, the AFT, the NYSED in New York State. They're loaded, these people, and they're bureaucratically bloated too. Yeah. And, so for me, it's that question. I go to Jeff Bezos's wife and say, you want a different kind of revenge?
That's a good idea. I like that one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm going to write a book, Labor Fantasies. Anyway, yeah, right. Yeah. So, thank you. Yeah.
So, but it does seem that the largest number of workers being organized are in those precarious service positions, such as Amazon, Starbucks. I don't know if Costco's already organized. It's already unionized.
James says they have nothing to lose. Really, in a way, if you really start thinking about this, who has nothing to lose at this point? Where's the audacity? The person that's an academic that has $1.5 million in TIA credit and is worried about losing their pension because, they might, no longer get the 11 or 12% contribution, or the person that's making, $25 to $50,000 a year that has, no pension, no benefits, etc. This is very real in terms of the of movements, right? And how do you get those people? And the great majority are in again, contingent. Really, it's really very, very important to understand this gig economy, this contingent force. And yeah. And the big unions don't seem to want to do this. I mean, I've studied NYSET, for example, New York State, United Teachers, and who is basically the state parent union for the PSC, for the Long Island University Faculty Federation, Pratt Institute, PACE downtown. And, basically they do nothing for contingent labor. There's no even organizational structure for the gig economy, even though 75, as I mentioned, 75% of the teaching labor in the United States is contingent. Of that 75%, a lot of these people have good, they're accountants making good money on Wall Street, or investment bankers who will teach a course, or nurses who have jobs in hospitals already and moonlight. But a good 50% of those depend on that money for making a living. Yeah. So this is another, I think, important aspect. Yeah. Anyway.
So, Jane, I do have good news. There are people asking me to organize something with you again for a broader forum. And also people are ordering your book.
Right.
But a couple people are about to sign off. So I think this has been a really great, I know it was a PowerPoint, but whatever, that opening slide presentation with your commentary was exceptionally good, and I've liked very much the Q&A period. So I appreciate your taking this time on Mother's Day and American Mother's Day. And I do have to call my mother, as a matter of fact. She's probably wondering why I haven't, even though it's not a big deal in my family. So thank you again, Jane.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
You know the work of Jamie Woodcock, I guess.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Very good on the platform, work. Very, very
It's great. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, wonderful. Hopefully I'll get to see you again sometime then. Yeah.
Great, Jane. Great meeting you as well.
Yeah, you too. You take care. Bye-bye.
Hey,